gigantic lake and even more gigantic statue of Confucius, and then many, many things around it, like a beautiful ancient palace, which is the birthplace of Confucius, which was then enlarged to be a very, very long and very large palace over the centuries. And then also incredibly well done modern museum, which has all the artifacts and writings and sculptures and paintings and so forth, including, by the way, a picture of the American founding fathers discussing Confucius. Now, that's a part of the history which I think would deserve to be much more known, because Benjamin Franklin was an absolute fan of Confucius, and he actually modeled his own education system on the teachings and moral and ethical teachings of Confucius. So I think this for sure could be a bridge, in present admittedly tense relations between the United States and China. But I think if one would go back to the roots of the American Revolution and the American Republic, showing the vicinity of some of its most important thinkers, especially Benjamin Franklin, but also some of the other founding fathers, it could actually help to lay the philosophical foundation for a better understanding. Because if one looks at the whole thing, it is quite amazing that there are many, many more similarities between what China is doing today in terms of its economics and the economic theory of the American system as it was developed by Alexander Hamilton. That's a fantastic, totally intriguing story. And in general, I can only tell people, go to China, build yourself your own opinion. You will be, if you have never been there and maybe only read what some of the Anglo-American think tanks are writing about China, I promise you, and I'm not doing this lightly, but I promise you, you will have the biggest positive culture shock in your life, because it's nothing like what you have been told. You find an enormous progress in terms of economic progress. The train system, they have about 40,000 miles of modern train system where the trains go, 350 kilometers, that's about 280 miles average an hour. They are fast, they are clean, it's all functioning, it's amazing. And then you have enormous construction, enormous modern buildings. China is now the leader of, I think, 57 high-tech areas of 66. So that's 57 of 66. That's amazing. In any case, I can only say, go there and form your opinion with your own eyes and own discussions with the people there, and you will come back transformed, and you will recognize that China could be the best friend of the United States if the United States just wants to be that.
Well, that's very exciting. And I want to come back to this American Revolution question. But before I do, I believe the conference you addressed was on the topic of green energy, et cetera. And I think your approach to that was very important and also informed the other participants. And perhaps you'd like to say something about the nature of the conference and your thinking on this matter.
Well, the conference was actually not on that topic. That topic was just one of several panels. The conference overall was by the China Media Group, and they had invited leading media from all over the world, from Europe, from Africa, from Asia. So there were many CEOs of national media organizations of their respective countries. And I think it was just a clear effort to, increase the communication about important conceptions. So my panel was just one of several, and the topic was indeed, on the greening of the economy and similar issues. But I think it was quite clear that, China, sure, they are now the world leader in building solar panels and windmills and so forth. But they are also the world leader in nuclear energy. So, in a certain sense, it's not that the green in China is an alternative for nuclear or fossil fuels. It's part of the mix. And I think that the issue of green in China, in any case, is very much different than, let's say, in Europe, in Germany in particular, where green is an ideology. It's a Malthusian idea of population reduction or population containment, of basically anti-science and anti-technology. But in China, it has a completely different meaning, because in the beginning of the industrialization in China, about 30 years ago, because this was mainly done by multinationals from international corporations, a lot of damage was done to the environment. So they did have a pollution problem for quite some time, dirty air, contaminated groundwater, and similar side effects. And so the Chinese leadership at a certain point decided to remedy that, and they did an absolutely remarkable job. For example, they took the entire heavy industry from Beijing, which was huge, given the fact that Beijing is a city of, I think, anywhere between 20 and 30 million inhabitants. So they took the entire heavy industry and relocated that to another city about 150 kilometers away. So now the air in Beijing is blue, totally blue sky. And they have basically managed to get this real economic environmental problems under control. So I think, nevertheless, the discussion was on greening the economy and so forth. And I think I could bring in the discussion an important idea, namely that if you look at energy, you just do not look at the apparent cost, because if you look at the apparent cost, you can say that it's cheaper to build a solar panel than to build a nuclear power plant. But if you look at the efficiency, you realize that nuclear power is much more cost efficient than solar power, because it has a much higher energy flux density. And since, as my late husband, Diane LaRouche, had developed a very important theoretical basis for that, there is a correlation between the energy flux density in the production process and the number of human beings which can be maintained on that level. And since solar and wind are extremely low in energy flux density, they have a low corresponding population density. So I could bring in this discussion, that if you want to maintain the presently living 8 billion people, and hopefully soon more, you cannot rely only on renewable energies, because that does not have the power to do so. And that actually caused some of the other panelists to pick up on the issue, and also naturally the issue of the just world economic order was becoming a big topic in the discussion. So I think it had a good impact.
Great. Now, on that question of energy, of course, we just had this massive blackout in Europe, with Spain supposedly leading the world or going to renewable energy, which doesn't seem to be working very well. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's really an irony, if I ever have seen that, because I think it was the 16th of April, Spain proudly proclaimed that they have now everything on renewable energy, and their entire grid is fed by solar and wind, a little bit of hydropower. And then just a few days later, literally less than 2 weeks, you had this blackout of Spain, Portugal, and even parts of France. And for many hours, the entire Ibero Peninsula was without energy. So this cost, I think the minimum cost is 5 billion damage just from that one day. And now naturally there is the big search of what was the cause. Naturally, the eternal propagandists immediately said, this must be a cyber attack, Russia must be behind it. Nothing of that sort is the case. And it's also, becoming more clear that it is the inherent flaw of the renewable energies, because if you have an entire grid fed by renewables, solar and wind, the energy is being produced when the wind blows and when the sun shines, and this stops when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. But in all other economies where this is being used, there is some kind of a backup where you have power plants which are fed by coal or gas or turbines or nuclear power, and that way you can compensate the sudden rush in superfluous energy or the sudden lack of not enough energy, and those other power plants can kick in and make sure that there is stability in the grid. If you don't have that, like Spain, you only have solar and wind, then if you have too much all of a sudden, you cannot compensate it and the grid blows out. This is basically an overstretching of the grid, and the inertia is not there, and the power has to be constantly more or less at 50 hertz. And in this case, the pressure only dropped like to 49.86. So that looks like a very, very tiny margin, but that was enough to bring down the entire national grid of Spain and Portugal. And naturally, the connection to France is very poor. That could also balance some of it because the Pyrenees Mountains are in between. So there are only very few grids which go over this mountain range. So that's why there was absolutely no balancing of it. So I think this incident could happen everywhere where you have a heavy reliance on the renewables. And naturally, the experts came out very quickly in Germany, said this could never happen here. But other experts have warned since a long time that exactly that same thing could happen in Germany and other countries who are in a similar situation. So I'm pretty sure that this will be reviewed. And once the causes are becoming very clear as a result of such an investigation, I'm absolutely sure that there will be a rethinking, because you cannot, what happens if entire European countries all of a sudden have blackouts? That's the catastrophic case. And I think that will lead to maybe it will take a little bit, but I think it will lead to a rethinking of this matter.
I would hope so. We had this experience in Texas just a few years ago with the, this is the oil producing state of the United States. And we had these crazy blackouts where hundreds of people died and the energy companies used it to gouge the cost. And we don't seem to have learned much, but I'm hoping that we're becoming smarter. I wanted to shift now because it is the 80th anniversary of Victory Day, May 8th and 9th, the defeat of fascism in Europe. And the foreign minister of Russia, Lavrov, has said that tangible results of the US-Russia dialogue may be seen in the near term. He said, quote, "There is hope that the promising trajectory of Russia-US dialogue will become reality. I anticipate a solid confirmation of the reciprocal interest between Moscow and Washington in the near term." He said this speaking at the conference of BRICS foreign ministers in Brazil just recently. And I would like your thoughts on this. I think this may be perhaps the most important initiative of President Trump to try and restore normal relations between the US and Russia. So what are your thoughts on this dynamic?
Well, I hope that President Trump's impulse is leading to a result in doing exactly that, to restore the strategically probably most important relations, because after all, Russia and the United States are the two nuclear powers which have the largest contingent of nuclear missiles, which could eliminate mankind 20 times over. So if they would come back to a normal relations, I think this is the strategic question number one, because without that, there is nothing. And therefore, I'm very unhappy with the fact that some of these Europeans, led by Keir Starmer from Great Britain, Macron from France, but unfortunately, there is such a thing called coalition of the willing, who are trying very openly to sabotage any such effort by Trump and Putin to not only restore relations, but to bring a peaceful end to the Ukraine war, which de facto has ended because of a lack of soldiers in Ukraine. It's just a continuous carnage which is going on, and anybody in their right mind who is trying to prolong this is just a cynical person who does not care at all about the Ukrainian people or the soldiers on both sides. So I think that that is very important, and the so-called coalition of the willing, I think they're just mad. I think there's absolutely nothing to gain. I mean, the very idea that Europe could replace the United States in the war against Russia is just megalomania, stupidity. And, I think the population, unfortunately, is being barraged by a lot of propaganda. So only a certain portion of the people can see how dangerous this is. And I think that since you mentioned the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, I mean, there is such a reversal, or one can almost say revanchist rewriting of history, so that, for example, the probably new chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, he does not go to Moscow, he goes to Kiev, and Kiev already has changed the date. They are no longer celebrating the end of World War II. They're now celebrating on the same day some ominous Europe Day, or some new title they have given to it. And I think it's really, Oliver Stone, for example, in my view, correctly blasted that and said these people are revanchist because they side with the wrong side of history. So,
is it also, let me just ask, is it also the case that they are not inviting Russian leadership to celebrations in Europe? After the Soviet Union lost 27 million people, and without their input, this war would not have been won. Is that still the case?
It's worse than that, because the outgoing government, this government of Chancellor Scholz, and this unspeakable foreign minister, who fortunately made her last trip in her function as such a foreign minister, because it was unbearable how she would go around the world and really damage the image of Germany wherever she would put a foot on the ground. But they together put in some, I don't know if it's a legislation or some, degree whereby nobody in an official position, this is also the case for the European Union, is allowed to participate in the Moscow celebrations unless they will be hit with sanctions. And in the case of Germany, I think it's also put under sort of a punishment if people go to the Russian embassy in Berlin on that day, expressing their appreciation for what the Soviet Union did in World War II. So it's really a shame. It's an absolute abomination. And it's obviously only to be explained by the extreme ability of people to forget history, to just live in the here and now. And that's one of the, present cultural campaigns to make people forget history and just think here and now, the pleasure in the here and now, everything else does not count. I mean, if you look at the culture, popular culture, there are many pop songs where people sing, drinking wine, feeling fine, you live only once, that kind of a absolute low mental state is being propagated from all channels, from TV, from television, from movies, whatnot. And I think it's a real shame, because if you forget history, well, there is a saying that you are sometimes forced to relive it either as a farce or as a bigger tragedy. And I hope that we can prevent that from happening. But I think it is an absolute abomination what is happening around that date in Europe.
I would say in the United States, we have a welcome change because for the past few years, there has not been a March of the Immortal Regiment where people's forebears who were involved in World War II, American and Russian, marched together and laid flowers and released white balloons and celebrated the end of that war in Europe. We were unable to hold such celebrations, but this year again, finally, there will be an Immortal Regiment March in Washington, D.C., on the 3rd of May. And I think that's really a welcome change and indicates a possibility of a new direction. Also, I wanted to bring up, and you already touched on the American Revolution, but the Russian intelligence service website had a lengthy statement with a rather unflattering cartoon of Ursula von der Leyen promoting this fascism. And they talked about the historical relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union or Russia, going back to the so-called Civil War, the British pro-slavery instigated war, where the Russians sent the Navy to New York and San Francisco on the side of Lincoln. They talked about the Suez Crisis, where the Soviet Union worked with Eisenhower to put Israel back in its place. And they talked about this kind of dynamic, which seems to me it would be a really natural basis for relations, just as Confucius gives us a basis to have relations between the US and China, that the relationship between the United States and Russia, if we revive this tradition, could be also very important. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it is the philosophy of myself and therefore the Schiller Institute that, if you want to have peaceful relations among nations, you should always focus on the positive contributions. I mean, if you go and talk to somebody and just emphasize the negative points, I could start World War III with you. If I say your nose is ugly, your dress is disgusting, your hairdo is miserable, and if I would keep this up and escalate, I'm sure that after some half hour we would be really enemies, On the other side, if I say, oh, Diane Sare, you are such a gifted musician, you have a sense of poetry, you are a worldly leader, then you would respond and, we could find out what is common to our interests and so forth. So that same principle should be applied to nations because, in every history, there are ups and downs. And as long as you have oligarchical and imperial political leaderships, it unfortunately happens that countries do bad things. But, if you want to repair a relationship, you emphasize the most, that was really bringing mankind forward. And I think in that sense, everything from the League of Neutrality and other points of cooperation, I think it's a very good sign that Russia is emphasizing these positive elements. And I think it would be very good if the American side would counter that with recounting their side of the story as much as you can.
I agree. Now, on the bad, exactly this example you just gave, I have to bring in India, Pakistan. These are two very large nations in which the British Empire has had a major destructive role, and I fear we are really on the brink of war. And I just want to read you the latest statements from Modi and the Information Minister of Pakistan. Modi has now said that he has given, quote, the armed forces have full operational freedom in choosing the means, targets, and dates of India's retaliation measures. This is for the terror attack on April 22nd that killed 26 or so tourists. And then Modi said further, and it sounds a bit like certain of our neocon war people, quote, "I say to the whole world, India will identify, trace, and punish every terrorist and their backers. We will pursue them to the ends of the earth." And then the Pakistan information minister wrote yesterday on X, quote, "Pakistan has credible intelligence that India intends to launch a military strike within the next 24 to 36 hours using the Pahalgam incident as a false pretext. Any act of aggression will be met with a decisive response. India will be fully responsible for any serious consequences in the region." And I know you and your late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, visited India many times, had a good friendship with Indira Gandhi, and are familiar also. Executive Intelligence Review published the letters of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the murdered former leader of Pakistan. So I really wanted to get your thoughts on this new effort, I think, by the British. Oh, and I wanted to add something. The Chinese response was to say we should investigate what happened before the response, which is quite different than the American response to 9/11. Investigations be damned, we're going to invade this country, invade that country. And the same thing with October 7th, the incursion, the terrorist attack on Israel. There was never an investigation, there were just actions. So I sort of appreciate the Chinese radical approach to find out what's going on first. But what are your thoughts on this?
Unfortunately, I think the situation is extremely dangerous because, Pakistan and India are both nuclear powers. And there was already one Pakistani minister who had mentioned, that all the Pakistani weapons are trained in the direction of India, and basically very bellicose threat to use those nuclear weapons. And obviously Modi's response is very harsh and bellicose as well. And I just hope that what he said is not true, because if it would be in 1 to 3 days, we could be in a nuclear catastrophe in no time. I mean, I can only say that the previous concerns of people internationally about non-proliferation and that the danger of nuclear war could come from even not the major nuclear powers, but some of the others, is very real. And so I think, I can only hope that, the defense minister of Pakistan, however, said something else, which I think is also extremely important. He said that all Pakistani involvement in the last decades were the result of being instrumentalized by the British and the United States, including the backing of terrorism coming from Pakistan soil after 9/11. And so I think that is definitely something to be aware of, because, now with the Trump administration, that is not the apparatus which did bet on that. That was Brzezinski and his Islamic card, which he had given as an order to the Trilateral Commission in their infamous meeting in Tokyo in 1975, which then led to the Western backing of the Quran schools, the building of the extremist Islam, jihadi, basically for Afghanistan first in the war against the Soviet Union. But then after that war was lost, these terrorist forces did not vanish. They spread to the entire region, to parts of the Soviet republics, to Chechnya, to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, other areas. So they infested the whole region. And then, as General Flynn was pointing to and tried to communicate to Obama in 2012, these forces, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, and however they changed, they were instrumentalized by the West, by the United States and other Western forces. So I think the reference by the Pakistan defense minister to that history is extremely important, because, only if you have a clear view and do not attribute that to nations, but to other forms of interest, can you have a policy to diffuse the whole danger. So I can only say that the hope is that there are several neighbors who immediately got active and tried to mediate between Pakistan and India, such as Iran, very importantly, and also China. And they are talking and they have positive relations to both sides. So one can only hope that their mediation will prevail and we will not look in a nuclear Armageddon over that crisis in the short term.
Thank you. That's a very important answer. We have many questions, but very little time. So I'm just going to pick two of them. One is from a German businessman who writes, I just read about your industrial triangle program from 1989 to 90 for improved relations between Germany and post-Soviet Russia when the wall came down. Assuming peace is achieved in Ukraine, would something similar to that work today? Have you drafted a proposal for today that would work and take into account the changing needs of both countries?
Well, I think the best outcome under the present circumstances, which are unfortunate because we are now 3 years into the war, and that war could have, or that beginning of the so-called special military operation could have ended in March 22. And at that time, the losses would have been minimal as compared to the horrendous destruction which has occurred in the remaining 3 years due to the sabotage of Boris Johnson primarily, but also some elements of the Biden administration. So the best which can happen now is to go to a ceasefire, first a truce, then the ceasefire, and then basically enter real peace negotiations, of which the reconstruction of Ukraine would be obviously the incentive, especially for the Ukrainians to agree to such a policy. And there, I think if one would go back to the idea as it existed before the war broke out, namely that the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative could be extended all the way into Europe, and then Ukraine would be sort of a bridge between the European parts and the Asian parts of Eurasia. And I think that is absolutely still a perspective, because I believe since a long time that even has to have concrete solutions for local problems and regional crises and so forth, but that we will only get out of this geopolitical confrontation by a global solution. I have called for global security and development architecture, which must take into account the interest of every single country on the planet to work, sort of a modern Peace of Westphalia approach. And then, one could really think in terms of cooperating between the countries of Eurasia in, taking care of all for Southeast Asia, which would include the reconstruction of Ukraine, but also the building of modern infrastructure in all of Europe and connecting it to the rest of Asia, and that way make it a continent or two continents of peace. So I'm absolutely certain that the Chinese are already thinking in this direction, and I can only hope that the Ukrainians realize that if they want to have a country and if they want to have a prosperity and a future, they should absolutely demand that such a solution is being put on the table.
Great. So I actually am going to slightly amend the last question, and you may want to address the upcoming conferences of the Schiller Institute, both in the United States and in Europe. And you had mentioned yesterday to some of us something that I think put things in very clear perspective, which is you spoke about the entropic nature of this British liberal imperialist system, which is bankrupt, the warmongers, the NATO drive, etc., as opposed to the new dynamic, which is emerging, which is growth-oriented and which is actually becoming stronger by the day. And of course, I think we have a very important role to play in that, both here in the United States and in Europe, because we are inside, if you will, the entropic system, although there's a shift going on clearly in both places. But what would you like to say about the conferences, or your thoughts on this potential crossroads for humanity?
Well, I don't know how to get this across in appropriate terms, but when I compare the mood, the outlook, the understanding of people in Germany, and with those, I just came back from this trip in China. It is amazing. It's like as if you are in two completely different universes. When you're talking in Germany to people, they are all miserable, afraid, depressed, pessimistic, just horrible. If you are in China, everything is completely different. Everybody, including the Chinese, but also the international guests, they are in a completely different mindset. They're thinking about constructing things, solving things, positive plans for the future, just an enormous positive and optimistic outlook. And I think that is the result of the fact that you cannot divide, in my view, the present political lineup with the old categories of left and right, and according to the seating order of the French Parliament at the time of the French Revolution. That does not fit anymore. There are people who are supposedly left, but they are progressive, and there are people on the right who are also progressive. So how do you unify that view? I think the better way is to actually say that the world is divided between those forces who are absolutely determined to keep the privileges of a few, and for the sake of these privileges are willing to go in the most destructive action possible. And then on the other side, you have people who are well-meaning, good-hearted, and task-oriented, and they're trying to make everything better, to have countries function together, to have economies function, to have elevated poetical ideas, who are basically anti-entropic in their mindset. And I think the overwhelming trend of our times is the latter, that the vast majority of people, the global south, the people who are actually the global majority, they are in a very constructive mood, which is why if we in the West would just pick up on that and say, look, let's collaborate and then solve the most important problems of our time, poverty, underdevelopment, and migrant question, by building up the countries from where people are running away. We could solve all problems so easily. And that will actually be conferences where we will try to make the people in the West understand that the narrative, which is the bellicose narrative, is not desired, and it will lead to a catastrophe, and that on the other side, the historic trend of mankind in this particular historic juncture is to overcome geopolitics and find a way of cooperation. So that, in short, will be the topic of both conferences, and I can only advise you subscribe to participate either in person or if you cannot travel by Zoom, but be a part of that. That's where history is being shaped right now in the most advanced way. So don't miss it.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity to get to speak with you and ask you questions. And I apologize to people who sent in questions we didn't get to, but I'm sure there will be more opportunities. So thank you again, and we will be speaking soon.
Yes, I hope so. Till soon.